next speaker has also appeared on many other television shows and internet shows, one of which I just listened to recently. He writes extensively on the subject of Bigfoot on his blog, and he has recently decided to do expeditions into national forest lands. Everybody, please welcome Cliff Barackman.
Gotta say, this is not bad for the first Southeast Texas conference. Holy smokes. And you know, the organizers are great, but really what makes a conference is all of us, the participants. We have a lot to be grateful for the organizers, but they have a lot to be grateful for all of us, the participants who came here to kind of share our love for Sasquatches. Now, my presentation today is going to be a little under the surface, as I used to tell my 10-year-olds. I always said by my 10-year-olds when I taught 5th grade, as an elementary school teacher for 14 years before TD grabbed me, that there's two kinds of questions. The first is on the surface, where it's like, what color is that cup? Oh, it's red, you can see it, you can touch the answer in the book. And there's also under the surface, which is like you have to use your brain and analyze what the book is telling you to learn something about it. So that's what we're gonna do today with some of the data. So the title of my presentation is the Recurrence of Sasquatch Individuals in the Footprint Data. If you follow me online at all, you know that I'm like a footprint nerd, basically. I do my best to collect as much footprint data as possible and then analyze it to see what we can learn from those footprints. The footprints are brief markers. A Sasquatch or whatever walked by at that time, recorded something in the ground. But that's all fine and good. We can say, oh, that footprint's 14.5 inches long, like the one from Patty from the Patterson-Gimlin film. Okay, it's 5 inches wide at the ball and 4 inches wide at the heel. But in a way, so what? They're big, they're not made like human footprints, but what can we learn from them about the animals? Because at this point, I'm not interested in the question if Sasquatches are real. I want to know how they live. What do they do? If they're real or not is a question that's been put to bed a long time ago by the evidence. And if you don't believe in Bigfoot, that's probably because you're not familiar with the evidence, and it's okay. It takes a lot of effort to get that information. And a lot of the evidence comes from footprint casts. So, if I can figure out this clicker, oh, there we go. Ask any tracker, ask any hunter the importance of footprints, and they'll say, oh yeah, footprints tell a story about whatever left them. This particular tracker wrote this amazing book, Mammal Tracks and Sign. It's the best one I've found on the subject. It's something like 800 pages long. It's very lengthy. And this Mark Elbrock guy says, the location of tracks and signs and the surrounding environment provide as much information about behavior, habits, and ecology as the signs themselves. What that basically means is that the footprints in the ground of any animal will tell a story. But if you look around and see the environment in which those footprints were left, it'll tell you a lot more of that same story. That's very, very important, whether you're tracking deer for dinner or Sasquatches for fun. But anyway, by tracking any animal, you can find out things like population estimates, territory size, the social structure of the species, the diet, and the foraging strategies and possible migration routes of whatever you're tracking, whether it's Sasquatches or deer or whatever. It doesn't really matter. And up here, just so you know, here is a track, a suspected Sasquatch that I've been looking at for a long time now. We'll get back to him later, or her later. This is a track left in a pile of, presumably, scat. It's stepped in scat in the meadow, otherwise it wouldn't have been recorded at all. And nearby, what else did I find? I found this log that weighed about 400 pounds, 300 pounds, moved to the side. I also found scraps in the middle of a meadow. I found scraps of salmon. Huh. Does that tell us a little bit about what might have been happening? The log and the footprint were only 15 feet away from one another. Not a direct correlation, but there's something to perhaps be learned there. So we're going to talk about looking at individual Sasquatches. Just like Cliff Barackman is an individual, Bobo is another individual. We're all individuals, and Sasquatches are the same thing. There are individual members of the species, and they are very, very rare. People who say there's several thousand of them in this one national forest are incorrect. Sorry to say that. There's probably some of you out in the audience. I'm a bum out to talk to, because I'm going to give you what my truth is no matter what I think you think of it. But Sasquatches are very, very rare. So we would expect to see the same individual Sasquatch popping up again and again in the same general area in the data set of footprints. And sure enough, that's what we find. Now let's look at these two footprint casts, for example. It's hard to see, but these are a half-inch grid. This print right here is, gosh, it's almost 17 inches long. It's quite long. This one's a bit shorter. Could that possibly be the same individual Sasquatch? Look at the toe positions. Look at the shape of the foot. I'm not going to make you raise your hand or not, but could it even be the same Sasquatch? It is. And I know that for a fact, because these two footprints came from the same track line. There were 5 footprints in a row, and they cast all 5 in a row, and these came from the same track line. I put this up here to kind of point out that even though they don't look the same, that does not mean that the same animal did not leave them. Because here's something that I'd say in every single lecture, even when I'm not talking about footprints. The footprint is not the shape of the foot. It is the shape of the damage done to the ground by the foot as it walks by. And the shape is determined by the pressure on each part of the foot as the creature shifts its weight through, the speed with which it was traveling, the moisture content of the ground, the kind of substrate that was walking through, the slope of the land, you name it. There's 100 variables that determine the shape of the footprint, but it is definitely not the shape of the foot, except under the most rare of circumstances. I want to talk a little bit about Sasquatch feet so you can understand how strange and wonky their feet are compared to ours. Here is a diagram. These two diagrams come from Dr. Jeff Meldrum, his interpretation of the anatomy. And just the bone structure right here on the left, this represents a Sasquatch foot based on markers and whatnot that can be seen on Sasquatch footprint casts that are consistent with one another. And over here on the right is a human foot. Right away you see a couple very subtle details. Okay, like the ankle bone is shifted a little bit forward in the Sasquatch foot compared to the human foot. And that's for biomechanical reasons. It makes perfect sense. You see that the metatarsals over here in the Sasquatch feet are a little bit shorter than they are in the human feet, a little bit more narrow and stuff. But what I really want to talk about is right here in this diagram. This is a presumed Sasquatch foot, and this is a human foot. The big difference here is the arch, or in the Sasquatch, the lack thereof. Sasquatches, like all of the other great apes, have retained flexibility in the mid part of their foot, which is very different than our foot. We have developed something called a longitudinal arch. It's your arch in your foot. It's a fancy name for your arch. And we have that because our ancestors chased their prey. We used to do something called persistence hunting, where basically, oh my gosh, that goat looks yummy. I'm going to chase it for a while. And when I get tired, I'm going to tag team Bobo, and he's going to chase the goat while I rest. And then when Bobo's tired, he's going to tag team me, and we're going to go back and forth where we get to rest, but the goat never does. And eventually we'll jump on it and kill it and eat it for dinner. It's called persistence hunting. It's a human strategy, but it's also a strategy cheetahs use, and wolves and other things. So anyway, that's why we have the arch, because that absorbs the shock of us running 4 or 5 hours at a time, which is unfathomable for me because I hate running at all. But that's why we have an arch, but Sasquatches are not made for that. They're big, bulky, covered in hair. They can't radiate heat to their environment. They have retained flexibility in the mid part of their foot. And because of that, you start seeing markers in their feet like this ridge of dirt that was raised up right behind the metatarsals, right? Human footprints don't look like that, but Sasquatch ones often do, and we'll see some examples of that. But this is one of the many differences between human and Sasquatch feet. Here's some other ones. This represents your foot, by the way. This is the front part of your foot, the ball and the toes, and this is the heel section. Sasquatch feet flex in the mid part. I just mentioned that. Here's an example of that, going up and down. But what we don't really appreciate is the flexibility of their feet, because they can also move the front part left and right a little bit. And also, look at this, kind of like askew. So they can actually move their feet a little bit, at least, on 3 axes about the mid-tarsal joint. It's not really a joint, it's a combination of bones working together as one joint. So it's not a true joint, but functionally it functions as a joint in the mid-tarsal area of the foot. And this cast, which somebody here owns, by the way, I sold one of these today. This cast shows that flexibility about all 3 axes. Really cool. You can see from the side, this big pressure thing right here, and the slope coming down, that is reminiscent of this right here. And you can see that how it goes straight like that, but yet crooked down here. That's reminiscent of this flexation. And I don't have a good angle on it, but it's also kind of wonky like that too. So with all that flexibility in the mid part of their foot, you would expect a huge variety of footprint shapes. And that's exactly what we find, which is no different than the other great apes, I might add. This is all congruent with the other great apes. Now, their mid part of their feet are not the only things that flex. Their toes are also very, very flexible. In fact, I deem them about as flexible as your fingers, and probably about as prehensile as well. And we can see 3 different examples here of footprints. Look at the toe slope here across the front of the foot. And look at these toes here. Big toe, 1, 2, 3, 4. Look at that 5th digit. It's pointing out that direction. By the way, this animal and this animal are the same animal. I'll get to that in a little while. And then look at this, the hallux, the big toe here is pointed out real wide, just like the 5th digit is here. But you can see there's a lot of flexibility in their feet. Now when you combine the toe splay like that with the fact that the mid part of their foot moves so readily and so easily, you can imagine there are just countless variations of footprint shapes that one might find. So it comes to be a problem, like how do we actually even identify these things, you know? Because the substrate conditions also make a big difference in footprint shapes. Here are 3 different casts. This is a little bit of toe slide right here, and this is a great cast because it shows you that the creature was probably running at the time and up only on the ball of its feet. The heel was off the ground, which is why you only get this section here. This is a cast of it, by the way. And look at that, there's that ridge of dirt that I mentioned, the mid-tarsal pressure ridge, right behind the metatarsals. And over here, this is an interesting cast because this is where it slid into the ground. It slid into the ground, thus splaying the toes very widely as the dirt like shoved up in between the toes, right? Just like if you took your hand and pushed it forward in mud, your fingers would probably splay as you went. I just accidentally pushed a button on here. I'm glad it didn't do anything. It's like, oh, I'm getting excited. I had a switch on the wall and I would go and switch it a bunch, and I got a letter from Germany telling me to stop. It's a Stephen Wright joke. Sorry, guys. So how do you even tell if footprints are the same animal or not? Well, back in 1982, some footprints were found in Grays Harbor County, Washington. A couple of you own this footprint as well, by the way, or this one right here. And a guy named Dennis Hereford, who was a sheriff at the time, he would start looking into these Bigfoot reports as long as there weren't any like more major crimes being committed that needed his attention. And it's Grays Harbor County. It's a pretty quiet place. You know, it's where Nirvana is from, actually. So they found footprints on April 22nd, 1982, and then over here on April 27th, just 5 days later. So what he did is he cast a couple of them, and some of them come from one site, some of them come from the other. We're not sure which ones because they didn't document it very well. despite the fact that they were police officers. So what Dennis Hereford did is that he took measurements of the length, the ball width, the toe width, the heel, blah, 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 compared one cast with the other, and tried to find where they matched up. A lot of documentation and a lot of data gathering, but he found that like the differences were minuscule. 1/4 inch in most places, sometimes a 1/2 inch, and that was really about it. Sometimes they were exactly the same. So he said, oh, these are probably the same ones. And when you look at it, Abbott Hill and Elma Gate are only about 5 or 7 miles away from each other, 5 days to get there, almost certainly the same animals. Well, that starts giving us a little bit of a clue, doesn't it, about population size in this area at the time. I think that's interesting. But this is one way you can look for them. It's like a similarity thing, like the lengths and the measurements are about the same. But then we get to these things. When you're out there Bigfooting, and this is a mistake that they used to make, by the way, back in the Roger Patterson days, in the 60s and whatnot, they would find the cleanest left and the cleanest right footprint and cast one of each, because they wanted to know what the foot looked like. Well, that's not very convincing to trackers at all. In fact, that makes the early prints oftentimes look like they're fakes, because they're so clean and beautiful. Well, if you really want to convince somebody that a track line is real, what you need to do is cast as many footprints as you can in a row, consecutively, no matter what the quality. And there are a small number of data hits like that in the data set, one of which was collected in 1987 at a place called Clicker Mountain. These are the 2 footprints that came from Clicker Mountain back in 1987. Same track line. We know these were the same, that both these prints came from the same Sasquatch. But look at all the differences in them. It's hard to believe unless you've been educated on the flexibility of the mid part of the foot and the toes, and then know a little bit about how substrate conditions change all that sometimes. By the way, this is 18 inches long, and this one's 16 inches long. Same foot made it though. But remember, the footprint is not the shape of the foot. It's the shape of the damage done to the ground by the foot as it walks by. So you get a 12.5% difference in length. These footprints were taken 5 in a row in Mill Creek watershed back in 1987. 15.5 inches, 17 inches, 14, 19.5 inches, and 15 inches. A 39% difference in length. Over 1/3 of the length of the prints. That's huge, but we know it's the same animal. I've posted things on my Facebook of 2 individual footprints and said, yeah, these are from the same thing. And then people have actually written, just proudly expressing their lack of education on the subject. Those are 2 inches different. They can't possibly be the same animal. Yes, they can. They totally can. This is 14 inches, and this is 19.5 inches. Here are 4 more, taken at the same time and same place in a row. 15, 14, 13.5, and 14.5, 11% difference in length. Here are 5 in a row, taken by Dr. Jeff Meldrum at 5 points. We get, 16, 15, 16.5, and 14.5. It's a 13% difference. So you get my point, though. There's a huge difference in length and shapes and all that stuff. So, to find out which footprints came from this animal is difficult, and we have to do more than just measure like Dennis Hereford did. Remember all the measurements the guy took? Because, and I've spoken to Dr. Meldrum about this at length, there's a qualitative judgment that we as humans can make. That people or things look similar to one another. Like you can look at my brother and I and see some similarities, but it would be really hard to write down those similarities by using a ruler and a piece of paper, right? And we have to use that same sort of skill that humans inherently have to look at some of these footprints and find the similarities. So what I have done is I have taken 2 footprints that I wish you could see a little bit more of, but like these are the Clicker Mountain ones. The two that were taken at Clicker Mountain back in '87, and by the way, that was April of '87. And November of '87, these 5 footprints were obtained in Mill Creek, not very far away, just a matter of probably 8 miles at the most, probably even less, probably like 5 miles. So what I did is I started, okay, well, I know these 2 are the same, and I know all 5 of these are the same. So I started looking, well, let's see if any of them look like a cast from the other set. And they do. It's kind of hard to see these wonky toes up here, but these wonky toes bear a striking similarity to these wonky toes. They even look like little sausages. Now, a lot of people think that these prints are fake because those toes don't look like toe pads, but they are also showing their lack of education on Sasquatch prints and the flexibility of the toes. Because whenever they walk, it's not true, I'm going to put my hand over here for a minute, it's not true that the toes always push down. Sometimes the toes are up as the thing pushes off. And if the toes are in an upwards flexation, only the toe stems would impress, which would give you a shape just like that which you cannot see right here because the screen's too high or low. And I started looking at this print over here. This is driving me nuts. Can I fix this? Can I try to fix this? That's good enough for me. It's good enough for Bigfoot hunting. Now, look at these toes right here. Does it not bear a superficial resemblance to this? And look, those toes there. Remember, the toe stems only are probably impressing here, which gives it that strange shape. Kind of similar to that, and this. I'm speculating that these are very likely the same animal, same general area, only a few miles away. Probably the same animal. So, I took the clicker, really. Sorry about that. I took the same Clicker Mountain prints, and I compared them to other footprints in the data set somewhere. Because there's a lot of footprints from the Blue Mountains in this general time period. Okay? So I found some other resemblance. These are those wonky toe things. This bears a strong resemblance to that print, right? And it turns out that there were 2 footprints gathered at that location. Look at the differences in the foot shape, particularly the toe shape. And of course, this one over here from Clicker looks a lot like that one. And this one looks a lot like the one with the slide behind it that I showed you, right? These 5 from Mill Creek, well, a couple of them, particularly these 2 at the end, look very much like the Wrinklefoot footprints from 1986. Table Springs is a bit further away. It's about 10 miles away. But are you seeing the similarities between them? Like the inherent, just qualitative similarities. Not quantitative, but qualitative. Mill Creek, these 2 we've already established. They're from the same track line. Then look at the toe slope. Look at the toe slope. And on this one, remember this one from the other data set, or the other footprint pair, and look at this toe set. So wait a minute, this animal is the same as this animal. Same Sasquatch left those footprints. All of these are the same animal. I've shown you how I came to that conclusion for almost all of these. This one here stepped on a rock, which is what that hole is there. That one's 18 inches long. But yet Wrinklefoot, the footprints are 14 inches long. A 14-inch foot made an 18-inch footprint. Remember, the footprint is not the shape of the foot. It's the shape of the damage done to the ground by the foot as the thing walks by. We have toe flexibility, we have foot flexibility, we have substrate differences. We've got a lot of issues going through here. But look at all of these amazing shapes showing the same Sasquatch was in all of these areas. That right away drops their population estimate dramatically. We basically have from 1982 to 1990, between 1 and 3 Sasquatches, leaving as many as 40 or 50 footprints in the same area. There are not very many of these things. But in 1990, that Bigfoot went away, and the footprints were not found again. A new one showed up. This is that individual. And the footprints started showing up in 1990. This set here this is the Dr. Meldrum set from 5 Points. And this is from Biscuit Ridge, just a few miles away. Let's start looking at some of the similarities, particularly in the toes. This individual is well known from its toe shape, and Morton's foot, where the second toe is a little bit longer than the hallux, the big toe. But can you see some similarities between, like, say, these toes up here and, say, these guys here? These toes up here look very similar to these toes, and actually these two. But here, 94, 96, 2 years apart, same general area. We know these are the same. Look at these other footprints that were found. This is the earliest occurrence of this individual from 1990, but it left 7 miles of footprints in 91, and in 92 it was back again, the same general area. The same individuals keep popping up again and again. Here are some examples from other parts of the country that I applied this sort of idea to. This is from a guy named Tom Shea. He runs a blog with very great information. Northern Kentucky Bigfoot Research Group, I think is what they're called. This footprint here is an original, so is this. This here, you got to go a little bit beyond the toes, although the toes bear some resemblance, but there's a big toe, 2, 3, 4, 5 toes. The toes kind of have that same shape over here, but it's really the ball of the foot. But again, the heel doesn't look the same, but it's probably a slide-in because of the differences. And this was taken, I don't know when this was taken, but I think it's the same animal, because look at the general shape of the ball right here. And it was all from the same area. It doesn't make sense that there would be 4 or 5 big, husky, 8.5-foot males running around in one area. It just doesn't make any sense from what we know about primate behavior. It's probably not true in your house. You're a primate, just like me, and kind of like them. Here are some other examples, and this is really cool stuff. This is very fresh stuff, for example. These footprints were 2015, 2016, 2016, 2017, and 2018. And notice it has kind of a narrow heel and a wide flaring toe, like a fan shape. That's how we've learned to identify this particular individual. This over here is most likely a heel slide or something like that. And I think the heel actually landed in this area, which is why it looks a little bit different than these, but I'm confident these are the same guy. These are the two of the same Sasquatch prints. By the way, also look how the big toe accommodated this rock. It actually moved around the rock as a step down. It's the toe flexibility, right? That's one of the things I mentioned earlier that makes their feet so unique compared to ours. This was, by the way, this is May 7th of this year. This is like last month. What? Oh yeah, March. I always get the past and future confused. You know, somebody once asked me how old I was, and I told them how long until I die. It's embarrassing. Cliff's kind of a weirdo, isn't he? Here are 2 juvenile prints. These are about 7 inches long. From Washington, from the Olympic Peninsula. I'm going to go back 1 or 2. I want to point out something that I didn't say before. These footprints and these footprints come within 5 miles of one another. An adult and a juvenile. That's super important because some of those footprints came within 2 miles of the Olympic Project nests that are being studied for DNA right now. The Olympic Project, led by Derek Randalls and a few other good folks out there, they have come across, they didn't discover them, but they were told about some weird-looking nests on the ground, if you haven't heard about this. Initially, they thought it might be bear nests until they went out and saw them. And all of these people, including the timber cruiser who pointed them to these nests, who've been working in the woods off-trail for 30-plus years, had never seen anything like them. So they brought in a bear biologist to say, hey, we've got these. What do you make of these, Mr. or Mrs. Bear biologist? And they said, well, if this is bear behavior, this is undocumented. We've never seen this before. To show you here, it looks like a big bird nest with a cliff in the middle of it. There's another one right here. But the thing is, when you're at the nest site, you have to belly crawl in there. It's in the middle of a huge, all of these. There's 21 that have been found on a 1.5 mile slope so far. Over 21 nests like this, ranging from 4.5 to 8.5 feet wide, have been found in this stretch. They're all in the middle of of giant huckleberry thickets. And when you're standing at a nest site, looking around, what you see in every direction are huckleberry branches broken and snapped off. Notice that it's snapped in the upwards direction, so it is not natural. No gravity or wind is doing that, but they are all snapped off for 20 yards in every direction. And the tops of those huckleberry branches were brought to the nest and woven in a circular fashion. A couple of the nests have been taken apart. And it turns out that the nests were purposefully built that way by interweaving these branches amongst sticks that were shoved into the ground to form a frame around which these huckleberry branches are woven. Is that for me? Tell them I'm busy. Sorry, it's okay, I'm just teasing you. I don't mind. I think it's funny. But anyway, look at these nests. So huckleberry branches are broken all around, and on top of that, by one of these nests were 2 rocks that apparently were brought up from the river because there's no other rocks there. These are clearly round river rocks, and when you look at them, you can kind of see it. There are score marks on them. They've been hit together. So these nests that are way off trail in the middle of huckleberry bushes that you can't even get to, with all the huckleberries branches being broken off, brought here, woven around sticks that have been shoved into the ground. Those nests have been found just 2 miles away from these footprints. That's a very strong correlation, especially since some of these footprints were found south of the nest site and others north. 2 individuals were seen the day before this footprint was recorded. The little one still has not been seen. But I'm strongly suspicious that these Bigfoots are the ones making and using these nests. That is some under the surface stuff, right? This is 16 inches long. You know, one of these footprints are 16 inches long, but this is under the surface. This is really interesting, valuable information. And it's brand new, it's cutting edge. By the way, the nests are being, 4 samples have now been turned into Dr. Todd Disotell for eDNA studies. There's a technology out there called environmental DNA, where you can take, say, water in a pond, and you want to know every single life form that lives in that pond. You can test the environment of that pond and find out if brown trout are in there, or brook trout, or bass, or bluegill. You can find every single species of animal, and probably plant, in a pond by testing the environment. Well, they've taken core samples of a number of these nests, and those core samples are now undergoing environmental DNA analysis. We will be able to tell that Cliff laid down in the nest, as well as the bears, possibly Bigfoots, or whatever else has been in the area around these nests. Now, some of you are saying, but we don't have any Bigfoot DNA. How are you going to know if it's Bigfoot DNA? Actually, it's not that hard because we can tell the family of animal that laid down in the nest. And they'll be able to tell if it's Cliff or something that's kind of like Cliff, but a lot hairier maybe. Because environmental DNA has now been used successfully on cave dirt in Asia. About 2 years ago, there was this cave that they suspected might have been used by ancient humans, hominins, specifically Neanderthals. And because the Neanderthal stuff was found in the area, but they didn't know for sure if they used this cave or not. But they wanted to try out this brand new technology, this brand new way of testing things, this eDNA thing, to see if perhaps Neanderthals might have, maybe there's some trace DNA in the cave dirt. So they tried it on the cave dirt. Not only did they find Neanderthals, even though no fossils or tools or art was found in the cave at all. None. But they did get Neanderthal DNA out of that cave dirt. And they also got another species of our own genus, Homo denisovin, the red deer people, known from only a couple finger bones. They identified 2 extinct species of hominin that had used that cave in the last 50,000 years. That is cool, and that means a lot to us Bigfooters, because Bigfoots are some sort of hominin. But let's look in the historical record and see what else we can learn about some Bigfoots. Like Bigfoot. Did you know that the name of the species, Bigfoot, came from the name of an individual Sasquatch? In 1958, Jerry Crew cast the first known Sasquatch footprint. It's right here. And it turns out that that individual Sasquatch, which they called Bigfoot, for obvious reasons, showed up kind of a lot in the time. So 1958, Palm in 1963. Looks like the same foot. And I'll do a better comparison in a few minutes. These were taken in 1963, just about 2 miles away from the original 1958 prints. These 2 prints, we're not exactly sure where they came from, but we know it's Bluff Creek. But clearly, you can see, just looking back and forth at these, it's the same animal, right? Clearly the same animal. So here are all of those footprints, and look at the similarities. And also keep in mind what I talked about with foot flexibility and toe flexation, as well as substrate and all that other stuff. Clearly the same animal. Okay, well, this is a map of Bluff Creek. There's the Patterson-Gimlin film site. If you've ever been there, Louse Camp is over in this area right here. Actually, it's right there. But this is where the 1958 Jerry Crew prints came from, on this road. This is where Laird Meadow is, 1963. That's where Roger Patterson cast this, almost 4 years to the day before he got the film, which is kind of weird. But that's one of the things you learn. You start studying where the tracks, and when the tracks show up, you can maybe predict where Bigfoots might appear in the future, and Roger did. We don't know where these came from. But this map right here is this little yellow section on this big map. Again, this section is this little yellow section, because these footprints were found down in Palm at a different time of year. We think that this particular animal is male because of what's called sexual dimorphism. Basically, different shapes of the body depending on if it's a boy or a girl. Di means 2, morph means shape, dimorphism. So, at the time, they're really big footprints. And then like the females tend to be smaller, just like every other species of primate. Well, it turns out that these came from Palm in April, and all these other footprints came in about October from up here. This is 60 miles in a straight line. But one ridge. You got to cross a river twice, but they don't care. Bigfoots don't care about much. You think honey badger don't care, and Bigfoot cares less. But this is one ridge from Bluff Creek down to Palm. So Sasquatches probably travel the ridges to some degree. A little insight into possible behaviors. Also, The females, see, 3 different footprints were found in Bluff Creek at this time. The big one, a medium one, and a smaller one. It's like the 3 bears. Down here in Hyam Palm, we had the big one and a different medium one. Huh. So are the males traveling 60 miles or more to go visit another member of their harem? And when he gets back to Bluff Creek, does the female say, "Is that lipstick on your hair?" These are from Patty, the Patterson-Gimlin film creature, the female in the Bluff Creek area. We know these are all from Patty because these 2 are the ones Roger and Bob took the same day as the film, and these 10 were taken at the film site by Bob Titmus 9 days later consecutively. Those are all Patty's prints. Some differences, but some similarities. And by now, I think at this stage in my presentation, you're probably starting to get a little bit of an eye about which prints might look similar and the differences. But it turns out there's been some really interesting footprint finds as early as 1958 that just might be Patty. The film, as we all, I'm sure, know, is taken in 1967. But in 1958, in November, these footprints were found. This is the original. All I did was I flipped it. So it's in the same position as this Patty print right here. Look at the toes and what these shape, the shape of the toes, and then compare it to the shape of these toes. Remarkably similar. And I've had Bigfoot researchers, very prominent Bigfoot researchers who produce publications and all that sort of stuff, say that, look, this is 15 inches long and this is 14 and a half. Clearly not the same animal. That's ridiculous. Now we know, just from those casting 5 or 8 in a row, that they can have a huge variety in length. But look at the toe shape. This is from 1959, also in November 3rd, if I remember right. It's all in the same time of year. Something that they learned by looking at the footprints, I might add. Look at the toe shape. Is it Patty? It could be. This is a 1960 footprint, probably by Peter Byrne, although some other people say that perhaps that's not correct. But this is generally thought to be Patty. Again, look at the toe shape. See the double ball right here? This is actually where the phalanges start and the metatarsals end, which is where this little bulge here. You can see that right there in the print. There are several markers on these 2 footprints that indicate that they could be the same animal. This was taken in 1962 by Betty Allen. Al Hodgson was there, who just died, by the way, sad day. But Betty Allen took this one. They drilled a hole in it to hang it from a doorknob, by the way. Wah, wah, wah. But again, look at the toe shape and like the slant of it coming down the forepart of the foot. Is it Patty? This is Patty. Is this, in 1962, just up the road from the Patterson-Gimlin film site? Here's another, 1963 by Al Hodgson. Again, look at the toe shape. Now, I've kind of rotated these to put the toes in the same position because a lot of people can't wrap their heads around the flexibility of the foot, so I want to put the toes in the same shape so you can see the similarities. Again, we know these are real. Like, if you think the PG film is fake, it's because you're ill-informed on it. It cannot be fake. But look at the toes. Blue Creek Mountain. Again, toes. Was it Patty? Just 3 months before the film was obtained? Less than 4 miles away? These prints right here are why Roger and Bob were in the area at all. August of 1967, October 1967. This is a really fascinating print because no one knows where it came from. It is generally thought to be 1967 in Bluff Creek, but it ended up in Dr. Grover Kranz's data set with very little background on it. But look at the toes compared to Patty. I think it's Patty. Now let's look where some of these came from. Going back to 1960, we don't know where this one came from. We are not sure where this one came from. As it turns out, Al Hodgson's 1963 print, that came from this area right here. These two came from the Bluff Creek Sandbar, which has now been washed away. Betty Allen's print came from the Bluff Creek Road that Jerry Crew built right above Louse Camp. And the Patterson-Gimlin film site is right there. Oh, and the Blue Creek Mountain stuff is right here. This is 3 miles there to there, so that's about 5 miles maybe. All one big area. Patty is the female in the Bluff Creek area at this time. Little side note, after Roger and Bob got the film, they cast Patty's footprints. It turns out that Titmus, when he arrived at the site 9 days later, tracked Patty up the river, up the slope, back around to a place where she's apparently sat down in the ferns and maybe watched Roger and Bob cast those footprints. And her footprints were never found again in Bluff Creek. She figured out that we were onto her. That's the level of intelligence we're dealing with here, by the way. So now what? Cliff's busy tracking individual Sasquatches in the certain general area over time. What does that do? Well, over here on the right, a few years ago I was contacted by Paul Freeman's daughter. He said, yeah, we have this map that my dad made of all the footprint finds in the Blue Mountains that he knew of, which includes Wes Summerlin's data, Dr. Grover Krantz's data, Bill Lowry's data, Dar Addington's data, John Myanzinski's data. This is that map. All these spots are places where either people saw Sasquatches or found footprints. I'm now working on something where I'm tracking those individuals over time to find out why they were in an area, because if you can find out where a Sasquatch was at a certain time, maybe you can figure out why it was there at that certain time, and then predict the future a little bit. So what we need to do is you need to cast. This is on all of you Bigfooters, by the way. If you don't think Bigfoot's are real, boy, are you in the wrong place. But like all you Bigfooters out here, if you're really a Bigfoot researcher, take my advice, please. Cast as many footprints from every location that you can, no matter what the quality. Cast and photograph them as many as possible with a scale item, please. No more foot. Don't keep your foot out of there. Put a ruler in there instead, please. Please, please, please. I get a lot of emails from you guys. Please do this for me. You need to document the location, hopefully with a GPS, but certainly on a map later. You need to take notes on the context. The footprint in the ground is cool, but if you notice that that stream over there is overflowing with trout, you better mark that down. If you notice that over here there's a bunch of deer sign and scrapes, at that time of year that's what they're doing, you better mark that down. Take note of the context. And please share your findings. If you have data like a footprint cast and are unwilling to show it to other people, it's exactly functionally the same as not having any data whatsoever. You might as well not have it. Your ego might be a little bit deflated, but it's the same thing. Don't collect data for your ego, collect it to share so we can all learn something about these wonderful creatures. And by doing all of this, we might be able to predict where individuals show up in the future. Proof in the pudding, man. You seen the Paul Freeman film? From D Duck Springs in, I think it was 94 in August. This big circle right there, you can't see it, but there's about 12 or 13, maybe as many as 24 footprint and sighting reports from D Duck Springs happening from July to September. Paul Freeman took that information and drove up there in his truck from Walla Walla the beginning of August every single morning at 6 a.m. And it wasn't 2 weeks before he got his film. He used the data that he had been collecting to predict where individuals might show up in the future. We can do this. We're Bigfooters, a bunch of weirdos, but we can do this. So, that is the task I give to you. It's not good enough to take a footprint. Take many footprints. I'm obsessive about it. When the London tracks showed up, I took 72 footprints from that location. 64 of which were consecutive. That's on you now. One up me, please. And when you do, let me know about it by going to any of those places. I'm very easy to find. If you can't spell my last name, just look up the words Cliff and Bigfoot on Google. It'll find me. All right? Thank you very, very much, guys.
and gentlemen. Let's hear some whoops. All right. A couple of whistles, too.